问题，包括我们的案例分析。那么本讲呢，我们就进行到这里啊，谢谢大家。
Hello, this is Roger Dawson. We're going to have lots of fun in the weeks ahead as I teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible by teaching you how to become a power negotiator. Several years ago, I recorded a tape cassette program called Secrets of Power Negotiating, published by Nightingale Conant in Chicago. To my delight and surprise, it became one of the best-selling tape programs of all time. Because of that, sales managers across the country started calling me to come to their company and teach their salespeople how to use power negotiating to raise their profit margins and close the sale even against lower price competition. From the giants such as IBM, Xerox, and General Foods to the smallest entrepreneurial startup companies, I've had a great time teaching. But what's more important, I've learned a great deal about salespeople, buyers, and the ongoing challenge of making the sale. In those years, salespeople have taught me volumes about the selling profession. They tell me that it's getting tougher out there. I'm sure you'd agree with that, wouldn't you? That buyers have more pressure on them than ever before to get your price down. Here's another thing that they told me, and I think you'll agree with this, that buyers are much better negotiators than they were 5 or 10 years ago. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you? Price pressure has become so great that whereas the slogan 20 years ago was, nothing happens until somebody sells something, we now have to amend that to nothing happens until somebody sells something at a profit. I hate to put it this bluntly, but here's what I think has happened. I think that the companies to whom you sell have figured out that the best and quickest way for them to put money on their bottom line is to take it right off of yours. Think about it for a moment. Your customers have 3 ways to improve their profits. The first way is to sell more, which means going head-to-head with a competitor to improve their market share by taking away some of their competitor's business, or by creating new or different products and carving out a new market for themselves, something that is very risky and expensive to do. The second way is to reduce their operating expenses by firing employees or buying expensive new equipment. The third way is far easier, to do a better job negotiating with you and their other suppliers, to take money right off of your bottom line and put it directly onto theirs. That's what General Motors decided to do when they put Ignacio Lopez in charge of their buying operations. In the first 6 months on the job, he saved General Motors $2 billion by renegotiating contracts with suppliers. He took $2 billion from their suppliers' bottom line and put it right onto General Motors' bottom line in 6 months. So what's happening is that companies are upgrading the position of buyer. Whereas 10 years ago, you may have been selling to a buyer who only moved up through the ranks, now you're dealing with someone who may have a master's degree in business, or he or she may have just come back from a week-long negotiating course at Harvard University, because doing a better job negotiating with you is a much easier way to improve their profits than increasing their market share or trying to shave more off their operating costs. How do you as a salesperson respond to this assault on your company's profits and on your personal income? The answer is power negotiating. When you learn to become a power negotiator, you'll know how to get anything you want from the buyer and still have them thinking that they won. And I don't mean doing this by tricking them into something they wouldn't do if they were smarter or better informed. I mean always leaving the buyer with the permanent perception that they won. Impossible, you say? No, not to a power negotiator. As a salesperson, you've probably heard that the objective of a negotiation is to create a win-win solution. A creative way that both you and the buyer can walk away from the negotiating table feeling that you won. You may have had this demonstrated to you with the illustration of the 2 people, both of whom want the orange, but are frustrated because they only have 1 orange between them. So they talk about it for a while and they decide that the best they can do is split the orange down the middle and each settle for half of what they really need. To be sure that it's fair, they decide that one will cut and the other will choose. However, as they talk about their underlying needs in the negotiation, they find that one wants the orange to make the juice, and the other needs it for the rind because he wants to bake a cake. They have magically found a way that both of them can win and neither has to lose. Oh, sure. That could happen in the real world, but it doesn't happen enough to make it worthwhile. Let's face it, when you're sitting down in front of a buyer, if you're lucky enough and skillful enough to get to sit down with the buyer, he wants the same thing that you want. There's not going to be a magical win-win solution. He wants the lowest price, and you want the highest price. He wants to take money right off of your bottom line and put it right onto his. Power negotiating takes a different position. Power negotiating teaches you how to win at the negotiating table, but leave the buyer thinking that he or she won. In fact, I'd almost give you that as a definition of a power negotiator. Two salespeople might go out to meet with two buyers who are in exactly the same circumstance. Both of the salespeople might close the sale at exactly the same price and terms, but the power negotiator comes away with the buyer feeling that he won. The poor negotiator comes away with the buyer feeling that he lost. I'll teach you how to do this, and do it in such a way that the buyer permanently feels that he won. He doesn't wake up the next morning thinking, now I know what that salesperson did to me. Wait until I see him again. No, he'll be thinking what a great time he had negotiating with you and how he can't wait to see you again. If you'll learn and apply the secrets of power negotiating that I'll teach you in this program, you'll never again feel that you lost to a buyer. You'll always come away from the negotiating table knowing that you won and knowing that you have improved your relationship with the buyer. So let's start out by talking about one of the most important things you can learn about power negotiating. In a later session, I'll talk about my 5 key principles for controlling a negotiation. This principle is probably number 2 on the list, the second most important thing that you can learn about negotiating. Ask the buyer for more than you expect to get. Henry Kissinger went so far as to say, effectiveness at the conference table depends on overstating one's demands. Isn't that interesting? One of the world's great international negotiators openly says that if you're planning to negotiate with him, you should expect him to ask for more than he thinks he'll get from you. Remember that if you were thinking, my buyers are not stupid, they'll know the minute I ask for more than I expect to get. Even if that were so, it's still an excellent negotiating principle. Think of some reasons why you should ask for more than you expect to get. Why, if you're convinced that the buyer wants to spread the business around, should you still ask for it all? Why should you ask for full list price even if you know that it's higher than the buyer's paying now? Why should you ask the buyer to invest in the top of the line even when you're convinced they're so budget conscious that they'll never spend that much? Why should you assume that they'll want to buy your extended service warranty even though you know they've never done that in the past? If you thought about this, you probably came up with a couple of good reasons to ask for more than you expect to get. The obvious answer is that it gives you some negotiating room. You can always come down, but you can never go up on price. Although when we get to ending negotiating gambits, I'll show you how to nibble for more. Some things are easier to get at the end of the negotiation than they are at the beginning. What you should be asking for is your MPP, your maximum plausible position. This is the most that you can ask for and still have the buyer see some plausibility in your position. The less you know about the other side, the higher your initial position should be for 2 reasons. First, you may be off in your assumptions. If you don't know the buyer or his needs well, he may be willing to pay more than you think. The second reason is that if this is a new relationship, you'll appear much more cooperative if you're able to make larger concessions. The better you know the buyer and his needs, the more you can modify your position. Conversely, if the other side doesn't know you, their initial demands may be more outrageous. If you're asking for far more than your maximum plausible position, imply some flexibility. If your initial position seems outrageous to the buyer and your attitude is take it or leave it, you may not even get the negotiation started. The buyer's response may simply be, then we don't have anything to talk about. However, you can get away with an outrageous opening position if you imply some flexibility. You might say, we may be able to modify this position once we know more about your needs more precisely, but based on what we know so far about the quantities you'd be ordering, the quality of the packaging, and not needing just-in-time inventory, our best price would be about $2.25 per widget. At that, the buyer will probably be thinking, that's outrageous, but he does seem so flexible, so I'll spend some time negotiating with him, and I'll see how low I can get him to go. Here's the problem for you as a salesperson. Your real MPP is probably much higher than you think it is. We all fear being ridiculed by the other side, which is something that I'll talk more about later when we discuss coercive power. We're all reluctant to take a position that will cause the buyer to laugh at us or put us down. So over the years, you have probably modified your MPP to the point where you're asking for far less than the maximum price that the buyer would think is plausible. The second reason for asking for more than you expect to get will be obvious to you if you're a positive thinker. You might just get it. You don't know how the universe is aligned that day. Perhaps the patron saint of salespeople is leaning over a cloud looking down at you and thinking, wow, look at that salesperson for XYZ Industries. She's been working so hard for so long now, let's just give her a break. So you might just get what you ask for. The third reason to ask for more than you expect to get is that it raises the perceived value of your product or service. When you show the buyer your printed price list, it imparts in his or her mind a subliminal value that he or she attaches to the item. Obviously, the effect is greater with an experienced buyer than it is with a seasoned pro, but the effect is always there. The fourth reason is that it's a great strategy for avoiding deadlocks caused by conflicting egos of the negotiators. Take a look at the Persian Gulf War. You do remember the Persian Gulf War. It was on CNN. What were we asking Saddam Hussein to do? Perhaps asking is not exactly the right word. President George Bush, in his State of the Union address, described our opening negotiating position by using a beautiful piece of alliteration probably written by Peggy Noonan. He said, I'm not bragging, I'm not bluffing, and I'm not bullying. But there are three things this man has to do. He has to get out of Kuwait. He has to restore the legitimate government of Kuwait. Don't do what the Soviets did in Afghanistan and install a puppet government. And he has to make reparations for the damage that he's done. That was a very clear and precise opening negotiating position. The problem was that this was also our bottom line. It was also the least for which we would settle. No wonder the situation deadlocked. It had to deadlock because we didn't give Saddam Hussein room to preserve his ego. If we'd have said, okay, we want you and all your cronies exiled, we want a non-Arab neutral government installed in Baghdad, we want UN supervision of the removal of all military capability, in addition, we want you out of Kuwait, the legitimate Kuwaiti government restored, and reparation for the damages that you did, then we could have gotten what we wanted and still let Saddam Hussein salvage his ego. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Roger, Saddam Hussein was not on my Christmas card list last year. I don't care if his ego deflates like a balloon that's been stuck with a hat pin. I agree with that. However, it creates a problem in negotiation. It creates deadlocks. From the Persian Gulf scenario, you could draw one of two conclusions. The first, and this is what Ross Perot might say, is that our State Department negotiators are complete blithering idiots. What's the second possibility? Right, that this was a situation where we wanted to create a deadlock because it served our purpose. We had absolutely no intention of settling for just the three things that George Bush had asked for in his State of the Union address. General Schwarzkopf, in his biography, It Doesn't Take a Hero, said, the minute we got there, we understood that anything less than a military victory was a defeat for the United States. We couldn't let Saddam Hussein pull 600,000 troops back across the border, leaving us wondering when he would choose to do it again. We had to have a reason to go in and take care of him militarily. So that was a situation where it served our purpose to create a deadlock. What concerns me is that when you're making a presentation to a buyer, you are inadvertently creating deadlocks because you don't have the courage to ask for more than you expect to get. There's a fifth reason to ask for more than you expect to get, and it's the reason power negotiators say that you should do it. It's the only way that you can create a climate where the buyer feels that he or she won. If you go in with your very best offer up front, there's no way that the buyer can negotiate with you and feel that they won. Inexperienced negotiators always want to start with their best offer. This is the salesperson who's saying to their sales manager, I'm going out on this big proposal today. I know that it's going to be competitive. I know that they're getting bids from people all over town. Let me cut the price up front, or we won't stand a chance of getting the order. Power negotiators know the value of asking for more than you expect to get. It's one of the key ways that you can create a climate where the other side feels that they won. In highly publicized negotiations, such as when the baseball players or airline pilots go on strike, the initial demands that both sides make are absolutely outrageous. I remember being involved in a union negotiation where I could barely believe the initial demands. The demand of the union was to triple the wages of the employees. The opening demand of the company was to make it an open shop. In other words, a voluntary union that would have the effect of destroying the power of the union at that location. However, power negotiators know that the initial demands in these types of negotiations are always extreme, so they don't let it bother them. They know that as the negotiation progresses, they will work their way in toward the middle, where they will find a solution with which both sides can live. Then they can both call a press conference and announce that they won in the negotiations. So particularly with egotistical buyers, always leave some room to let them have a win. Power negotiators always ask for more than they expect to get. So let's recap the 5 reasons for asking for more than you expect to get. 1, it gives you some negotiating room. You can always come down, but you can never go up. 2, you might just get it. 3, it raises the perceived value of your product or service. 4, it avoids deadlocks caused by conflicting egos of the negotiators. 5, it creates a climate where the other side can win. Ask for more than you expect to get. It seems like such an obvious principle, but it's something that you can virtually count on in a negotiation. In thousands of workshop situations and in tens of thousands of traceable real-life situations, this is something that has proven itself over and over again. The more you ask for, the more you're going to get. The counter gamut, when the buyer is asking you for more than he expects to get, is to recognize the gamut, appeal to his sense of fair play, and use higher authority and good guy, bad guy, 2 gambits that I'll teach you later. You should say, of course you could open negotiation at any figure you choose, and I could respond with an equally outrageous proposal, but neither of us would benefit from that approach. Why don't you tell me the highest price you can live with, and I'll take it to my people, and I'll see what I can do for you with them. Fair enough? So one of the key things to remember about power negotiating is that you should always ask for more than you expect to get. The next question has to be, if you're asking for more than you expect to get, how much more than you expect to get should you ask for? The answer is that you should bracket your objective. Your initial proposal should be an equal distance on the other side of your objective as their proposal. Now, let me give you a simple example of that. The buyer is offering you $1.60 for your widgets. You can live with $1.70. Bracketing tells you that you should have started at $1.80. Then if you end up in the middle, you'll still make your objective. Of course, it's not always true that you'll end up in the middle, but wow, is that a good assumption to make if you don't have anything else on which to go. Assume that you'll end up in the middle, midway between the 2 opening negotiating positions. And if you track that, I think that how often it happens will amaze you. In little things and in big things. In little things. Your son comes to you and he says he needs $20 for a fishing trip he's going to take this weekend. You say, no way, I'm not going to give you $20. Do you realize that when I was your age, I got a 50-cent a week allowance? I had to work for that. I'll give you $10 and not a penny more. Your son says, I can't do it for $10. Now you have established a negotiating range. He's asking for $20. You're willing to pay $10. See how often you end up at $15. In our culture, splitting the difference always seems fair. In big things, in 1982, Treasury Secretary Donald Regan and Federal Reserve Board Chairman Paul Volcker were negotiating the huge payoff of a huge international loan with the government of Mexico. Mexico was about to default on an $82 billion loan. Their chief negotiator was Jesus Herzog, their finance minister. In a creative solution, they agreed to contribute huge amounts of petroleum to our strategic petroleum reserve. However, that didn't settle it all. We proposed to the Mexicans that they pay us a $100 million negotiating fee, which was a politically acceptable way for them to pay us accrued interest. When President Lopez Portillo heard what we were asking for, he went ballistic. He said the equivalent of, you tell Ronald Reagan to drop dead. We're not paying the United States a negotiating fee. Not 1 peso. Nada. So here we have the negotiating range established. We're asking for $100 million. They're offering 0. Guess what they ended up paying us? That's right, $50 million. How much do you think they would have paid us if we'd have asked for $50 million? You got it. Probably $25 million. So often, in little things and in big things, we end up splitting the difference. With bracketing, power negotiators are assured that if that happens, they still get what they want. Bracketing assumes one thing, that you got the other side to state their position first. That principle is in my top 5 also. It's one of the 5 most important issues for you to learn about power negotiating. Get the other side to commit first. Don't let the buyer say to you, you just give us your best price and we'll tell you whether we'll accept it or not. That's a terrible negotiating position for you to be in. It's a wonderful negotiating position for the buyer. That's him saying to you, you make a commitment to us, but we're not going to make any commitment to you at all. That's a wonderful negotiating position for the buyer. It's a terrible negotiating position for you. I now believe that any commitment from the buyer is better than no commitment at all. I think you'd be better off if the buyer was saying to you, I want you to give it to me, than have them saying to you, you just give me your lowest price and I'll tell you if I'll take it or not. If the buyer can get you to state your position first, he can bracket you so that if you end up splitting the difference, as so often happens, the buyer ends up getting what he or she wants. That's an underlying principle of negotiating that I'll get back to later. Get the other side to state their position first. It may not be as bad as you fear, and it's necessary so that you can bracket their proposal. Conversely, don't let the other side trick you into committing first. If the status quo is fine with you and there's no pressure on you to make a move, be bold enough to say to the other side, you're the one who approached me, the way things are satisfies me. If you want to do this, you'll have to make a proposal to me. If Paul McCartney had learned to avoid making the first offer, he'd be even richer today. In the early days of the Beatles, their manager Brian Epstein was negotiating a contract for their first movie. United Artists had planned it as a teenage exploitation movie and budgeted only $300,000. The producer offered Epstein $25,000 and a percentage of the profits. United Artists was willing to pay up to 25% of the profits if the Beatles would agree to the token cash payment. But he was a good enough negotiator to play his hand close to the vest. Without revealing his position, he asked Brian Epstein what he wanted first. Brian was not used to big numbers yet, and furthermore hadn't taken the time to research the industry. He assertively replied that he wouldn't accept a penny less than 7.5%. The movie, A Hard Day's Night, was an international success, and Brian's error of making the first offer cost the Beatles millions. Another benefit to bracketing is that it tells you how big your concessions can be as the negotiation progresses. Let's go back to the widget sales situation. The buyer has told you that he can't go a penny over $1.60. You told the buyer that your company would be losing money at a penny less than $1.80. Your goal is to get to $1.70. The buyer comes up to $1.63. You can move down now to $1.77, and your goal will still be in the middle of the two proposals that are on the negotiating table. In that way, you can move in on your target and know that if the other side offers to split the difference, you can still make your goal. However, don't forget what I told you earlier, that if you go in with a ridiculously high offer, you might scare the buyer off by being too forceful. If you start out by saying our list price on widgets is $1.80, and the only time we ever deviate from that is for carload quantities, you may offend the buyer with such a high price, and he or she won't even start negotiating with you. My advice is to go in high, but imply flexibility in the offer. You might say, our list price is $1.80, but if you're prepared to give me a substantial part of your business, I may be able to do better. What would it take to get a major commitment from you? So rather than go in with the $1.80 offer and imply take it or leave it, you're better off to imply flexibility. Your price may be high, but because you are indicating a willingness to negotiate, the buyer has a tendency to think, it sounds as though we can get him down from that. Why don't I spend some time and see if I can get them down to a lower price than I'm paying now? It's the better way to get the negotiations started. The counter gambit to bracketing is to prevent the buyer from being able to do it to you by getting him to commit to a position first. If you don't state your position first, the buyer can't bracket you. Let's recap the key points about bracketing. 1. Assume that you'll end up midway between the two opening negotiating positions. 2. You can only bracket if you get the buyer to state his or her position first. 3. Continue bracketing as you make concessions. So in our first session, I've taught you 3 of the most important things that you can learn about negotiating the sale. That you should ask for more than you expect to get the buyer to commit to a position before you have to, and bracket your objectives so that if you end up in the middle, you get what you want. In our next session together, I'll teach you how to deal with the buyer who is grinding away on you for a better deal, and I'll also teach you how to deal with the buyer who doesn't appear to want what you're selling. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. Roger Dawson, welcome back to the second in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last program, we talked about 2 of the most important principles in sales negotiation. Ask for more than you expect to get, and how to bracket the buyer's proposal. In this program, I'll teach you 3 more key principles. Why you should never say yes to the first offer, why you should always flinch at the buyer's suggestions, and how to deal with a buyer who doesn't appear to want what you're selling. Okay, so let's get started with a major rule. Never say yes to the first offer or counteroffer. You should never do this because it automatically triggers 2 thoughts in the buyer's mind. Put yourself in the buyer's shoes for a moment. Let's say that you're the buyer for a maker of aircraft engines, and you're about to meet with a salesperson who represents the manufacturer of engine bearings, something that's a vital component for you. Your regular supplier has let you down, and you need to make an emergency purchase from this new company. They are the only people who can supply within the 30 days that you need to prevent a shutdown of your assembly line. If you can't supply the engines on time, it will invalidate your contract with the aircraft manufacturer that gives you 85% of your business. Under these circumstances, the price of the bearings you need is definitely not a high priority. However, as your secretary announces the arrival of the salesperson, you think to yourself, I'll be a good negotiator. Just to see what happens, I'll make him a super low offer. The salesperson makes his presentation and assures you that he can ship on time to your specifications. He quotes you a price of $250 each for the bearings. This surprises you because you've been paying $275 for them. However, you manage to mask your surprise and respond with, we've only been paying $175. To which the salesperson responds, okay, we can match that. At this point, you almost certainly have 2 responses. 1, I could have done better. 2, something must be wrong. In the thousands of seminars that I've conducted over the years, I've posed a situation such as this to audiences, and I can't recall getting anything other than these 2 responses. Sometimes people reverse them, but usually the response is automatic. I could have done better, and something must be wrong. Let's look at each of these responses separately. First reaction, I could have done better. The interesting thing about this is that it doesn't have a thing to do with the price. It only has to do with the way the other person reacts to the proposal. What if the bearing salesperson had agreed to $150 or $125? Wouldn't you still think that you could have done better? Several years ago, I bought 100 acres of land in Eatonville, Washington, a beautiful little town just west of Mount Rainier. The seller was asking $185,000 for the land. I analyzed the property and decided that if I could get it for $150,000, it would be a terrific buy. So I bracketed that price and I asked the real estate agent to present an offer to the seller at $115,050. Specific numbers build credibility, so you're more likely to get them to accept an offer such as this than have them counter at a higher price. I went back to La Habra Heights, California, where I live, leaving the agent to present the offer to the seller. Frankly, I thought I'd be lucky if they responded with any kind of counteroffer on a proposal this low. To my amazement, I got the offer back in the mail a few days later, accepted at the price and terms that I had proposed. I know that I got a terrific buy on the land. Within a year, I'd sold 60 of the acres for more than I paid for the whole 100. Later, I sold another 20 acres for more than I paid for the whole 100. So when they accepted my offer, I should have been thinking, wow, that's terrific. I couldn't have gotten a lower price. That's what I should have been thinking, but I wasn't. I was thinking I could have done better. So it doesn't have anything to do with the price. It only has to do with the way the other side reacts to the proposal. Second reaction, something must be wrong. My second reaction when I received the accepted offer on the land was, something must be wrong. I'm going to take a really thorough look at the preliminary title report when it comes in. The second thought that the buyer of the bearings will have is, something must be wrong. Maybe something's changed in the market since I last negotiated a bearing contract. Instead of going ahead, I think I'll tell the salesperson that I've got to check with the committee and then talk to some other suppliers. These two reactions will go through anybody's mind if you say yes to the first offer. Let's say that your son came to you and said, could I borrow the car tonight? And you said, sure, son, take it, have a wonderful time. Wouldn't he automatically think, I could have done better. I could have gotten $10 for the movie out of this. And wouldn't he automatically think, what's going on here? How come they want me out of the house? What's going on that I don't understand? Never jumping at the first offer is a very easy negotiating principle to understand, but it's very hard to remember when you're in the thick of a negotiation. You may have formed a mental picture of how you expect the buyer to respond, and that is a dangerous thing to do. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, the unforgivable sin of a commander is to form a picture, to assume that the enemy will act in a certain way in a given situation when his response may be altogether different. So you're expecting them to counter at a ridiculously low figure, and to your surprise, the buyer's proposal is much more reasonable than you expected it to be. So power negotiators are careful that they don't fall into the trap of saying yes too quickly, automatically triggering in the buyer's mind, one, I could have done better, and next time I will. A sophisticated buyer won't tell you that he felt that he lost in the negotiation, but he will tuck it away in the back of his mind thinking, the next time I deal with a salesperson, I'll be a tougher negotiator. I won't leave any money on the table next time. And two, something must be wrong. Turning down the first offer may be tough to do, particularly if you've been calling on the buyer for months, and just as you're about to give up, they come through with a proposal. It will tempt you to grab what you can. When this happens, be a power negotiator. Remember not to say yes too quickly. I used to think that it was a 100% rule that you should never say yes to the first offer until I heard from a real estate office manager in Los Angeles who told me, I was driving down Hollywood Boulevard last night listening to your audio cassette tapes in my car. I stopped at the gas station to use the restroom. When I came back to my car, somebody stuck a gun in my ribs and said, okay, buddy, give me your wallet. Well, I'd just been listening to your tapes. So I said, here's what I'm prepared to do. I'll give you the cash, but let me keep the wallet and the credit cards. Fair enough? And he said, buddy, you didn't listen to me, did you? Give me the wallet. So sometimes you should say yes to the first offer, but it's almost a 100% rule that you shouldn't. The counter gambit to never jumping at the first offer is to protect yourself with higher authority. Always be thinking to yourself, whatever the buyer's counter proposal may be, I can't accept it. I have to take it to my committee. These are the key points to remember. 1, never say yes to the first offer or counteroffer from the buyer. It automatically triggers two thoughts. I could have done better, and next time I will, and something must be wrong. 2, the biggest danger is when you've formed a mental picture of how the buyer will respond to your proposal, and he comes back much higher than you expected. Prepare for this possibility so that it won't catch you off guard. The next gambit I want to teach you will sound like the silliest when I first tell you about it. But don't let its simplicity fool you. It's very powerful. I get more people call my office or come up to me at seminars to tell me about their success with this than any gambit I teach. It's called flinching. Power negotiators know that you should always flinch, which means to react with shock and surprise at the buyer's proposals. Let's say that you're in a resort area and stop to watch one of those charcoal sketch artists. He doesn't have the price posted, and he has the shield sitting on the stool. You ask him how much he charges, and he tells you $15. If that doesn't appear to shock you, his next words will be, and $5 extra for color. If you still don't appear to be shocked, he'll say, and we have these shipping cartons here. You'll need one of these too. As opposed to, with a flinch, how much is the sketch? $15. $15! That's a lot of money. He says, well, I'll tell you what I do. I'll normally charge $5 extra for the color, but for you, I'll throw it in at no extra charge. That's still a lot of money, you say. He says, well, come here. I have never, ever done this before, but you are such a nice person. I'll not only throw in the color, I'll give you one of these shipping cartons too. See the difference? Perhaps you know someone who would never flinch like that because it's beneath their dignity. The kind of person who would walk into a store and would say to the clerk, "How much is the coat in the window?" The clerk would respond, $2,000. "That's not bad," they'll say. "I would be having a heart attack in the background." I know it sounds dumb, and I know it sounds ridiculous, but the truth of the matter is that when the buyers make a proposal to you, they are watching for your reaction. They may not think for a moment that you'll agree to their request. They've just thrown it out to see what your reaction will be. For example, you sell computers, and the buyer asks you to include an extended warranty. You sell cars, and the buyer asks you to include free floor mats and a tank of gas. You sell contractor supplies, and the buyer asks you to deliver it to the job site at no extra charge. You sell fax machines, and the buyer asks you to include a year's supply of paper. In each of these situations, the buyer may not have thought for a moment that you would go along with his request. But if you don't flinch, he or she will automatically think, "Maybe I will get them to go along with that. I didn't think they would, but I think I'll be a tough negotiator and see how far I can get them to go." It's very interesting to observe a negotiation when you know what both sides are thinking. Wouldn't that be fascinating for you? Wouldn't you love to know what's going on in the buyer's mind when you're negotiating with him? When I conduct my 1 or 2 day Secrets of Power negotiating seminars, we break up into groups and do some negotiating to practice the principles that I teach. I create a workshop and customize it to the industry in which the participants are involved. If they're medical equipment salespeople, they may find themselves negotiating the sale of laser surgery equipment to a hospital. If they're printing salespeople, the workshop may involve the acquisition of a smaller printing company in an outlying town. I break the audience up into buyers, sellers, and referees. The referees are in a very interesting position because they have been in on the planning sessions of both the buyers and the sellers. They know each side's negotiating range. They know what the opening offer is going to be, and they know how far each side will go. So the sellers of the printing company would go as low as $700,000, but they may start as high as $2 million. The buyers may start at $400,000, but they're willing to go to $1.5 million if they have to. We call that the high and the low of each side's negotiating range. Hopefully, the high end of the buyer's negotiating range is more than the low end of the seller's negotiating range. We call the extent to which the two negotiating ranges overlap the acceptance range. So the combined negotiating range of the buyers and sellers is $400,000 to $2 million. But the acceptance range is $700,000 to $1.5 million. The negotiating starts with each side trying to get the other side to put their offer on the table first. After a while, somebody has to break the ice, so the seller suggests the $2 million that is the top of their negotiating range. In their mind, $2 million is ridiculously high, and they barely have the nerve to propose it. They think they're going to get laughed out of the room the minute they do. However, to their surprise, the buyers don't appear to be that shocked. They expected the buyers to say, "You want us to do what? You must be out of your minds." What they respond with is much milder. Perhaps, "We don't think we're prepared to go that high." In an instant, the negotiation changes. The moment ago, the $2 million had seemed to be an impossible goal. Now the sellers are thinking that perhaps they're not as far apart as they thought they were. Now they're thinking, let's hang in, let's be tough negotiators, maybe we will get this much. Flinching is critical because most people believe more what they see than what they hear. The visual overrides the auditory in most people. It's safe to assume that at least 70% of your buyers will be visuals. What they see is more important than what they hear. I'm sure that you've had some exposure to neurolinguistic programming. You know that people are either visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. What they feel is paramount. There are a few gustatory, taste, and olfactory smell people out there, but not many, and they're chefs or perfume makers, not buyers. If you'd like to know what you are, close your eyes for 10 seconds. Wait a minute, you're not closing your eyes. Is that because you've had a problem with an Englishman in the past? That's why they say the sun never sets on the British Empire, because even God wouldn't trust an Englishman in the dark. Go ahead, close your eyes and think of the house in which you lived when you were 10 years old. You probably saw the house in your mind, so you're a visual. Perhaps you didn't get a good visual picture, but you heard what was going on, perhaps trains passing by or children playing. That means you're auditory. Some auditories are very auditory. Neil Berman is a psychotherapist friend of mine in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He can remember every conversation he's ever had with a patient, but if he meets them in the supermarket, he doesn't remember them. The minute they say good morning to him, he thinks, oh yes, that's the bipolar personality with antisocial tendencies. The third possibility is that you didn't so much see or hear, but you just got a feeling for what it was like when you were 10. That makes you a kinesthetic. Assume that people are visual unless you have something else to go on. That's the importance of flinching in response to a proposal from the buyer. Don't dismiss flinching as childish or too theatrical until you've had a chance to see how effective it can be. The effectiveness of flinching always surprises my students when they first use it. A woman told me that she flinched when selecting a bottle of wine in one of Boston's finest restaurants, and the wine steward immediately dropped the price by $5. A man told me that a simple flinch caused a salesperson to take $2,000 off the price of a Corvette. A speaker friend of mine attended my seminar in Orange County, California, and decided to see if he could use it to get his speaking fees up. At the time, he was just getting started and was charging $1,500. He went to a company and proposed that they hire him to do some in-house training. The training director said, "We might be interested in having you work for us, but the most we can pay you is $1,500. In the past, he would have said, "That's what I charge." But now he gasped in surprise and said, $1,500? I can't afford to do it for $1,500. The training director frowned thoughtfully and said, "Well, the most we've ever offered any speaker is $2,500, so that's the very best we can do." That meant $1,000 of additional profit line dollars per speech to my friend, and it only took him 15 seconds to do it. Not bad pay. The counter gambit to the flinch is to smile and recognize the gambit. That was a terrific flinch. Where did you learn how to do that? If he tells you that it was from watching this program, you'll have a lot in common, won't you? These are the key points to remember. 1, flinch in reaction to a proposal from the buyer. They may not expect to get what they're asking for, and if you don't show surprise, you're communicating that it's a possibility. 2, a concession often follows a flinch. If you don't flinch, it makes the buyer a tougher negotiator. 3, assume that the buyer is visual unless you have something else to go on. 4, even if you're not face-to-face with the buyer, you can still gasp in shock and surprise because phone flinches can also be very effective. Now let me teach you how to play reluctant seller and defend yourself against the reluctant buyer. Imagine for a moment that you own a sailboat and you're desperate to sell it. It was fun when you first got it, but now you hardly ever use it, and the maintenance and slip fees are eating you alive. It's early Sunday morning, and you've given up the chance to play golf with your buddies because you need to be down at the marina cleaning your boat. You're scrubbing away and cursing your stupidity for even having bought the boat. Just as you're thinking, "I'm going to give this turkey away to the next person who comes along," you look up and see an expensively dressed, silver-haired man with a young girl on his arm coming down the dock. He's wearing Gucci loafers, white slacks, and a blue Burberry's blazer topped off with a silk cravat. His young girlfriend is wearing high heels, a silk sheath dress, big sunglasses, and huge diamond earrings. They stop at your boat, and the man says, "That's a fine-looking boat, young man. By any chance, is it for sale?" His girlfriend snuggles out to him and says, "Oh, let's buy it, Poopsie. We'll have so much fun." You feel your heart starting to burst with joy, and your mind is singing, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus." Expressing that sentiment is not going to get you the best price for your boat, is it? How are you going to get the best price? By playing reluctant seller. You keep on scrubbing and say, "You're welcome to come on board, although I hadn't thought of selling the boat." You give them a tour of the boat, and at every step of the way you tell them how much you love the boat and how much fun you have sailing her. Finally, you tell them, "I can see how perfect this boat would be for you and how much fun you'd have with it, but I really don't think that I could ever bear to part with it. However, just to be fair to you, what is the very best price you would give me?" Power negotiators know that this reluctant seller technique squeezes the negotiating range before the negotiation even starts. If you've done a good job of building the other person's desire to own the boat, they will have formed a negotiating range in their mind. They may be thinking, I'd be willing to go to $30,000, $25,000 would be a fair deal, and $20,000 would be a bargain. So their negotiating range is from $20,000 to $30,000. Just by playing reluctant seller, you will have moved them up through that range. If you'd appeared eager to sell, they may have offered you $20,000. By playing reluctant seller, you may have moved them up to the midpoint or even the high point of their negotiating range before the negotiations even start. One of my power negotiators is an extremely rich and powerful investor, a man who owns real estate all over town. He probably owns real estate worth $50 million, owes $35 million in loans, and therefore has a net worth of about $15 million. Very successful, what you might justifiably call a heavy hitter. He likes wheeling and dealing. Like many investors, his strategy is simple. Buy a property at the right price and on the right terms, hold on to it, let it appreciate, and then sell at a higher price. Many smaller investors bring him purchase offers for one of his buildings, eager to acquire one of his better-known properties. And when that happens, he always uses the reluctant buyer gambit. He reads the offer quietly, and when he's finished, slides it thoughtfully back across the desk, saying, I don't know, of all my properties, I have very special feelings for this one. I was thinking of keeping it and giving it to my daughter for her college graduation present, and I really don't think that I would part for it for anything less than the full asking price. You understand, this particular property is worth a great deal to me. But look, it was good of you to bring an offer for me, and in all fairness, so that you won't have wasted your time, what is the very best price you would give me? Many times I saw him make thousands of dollars in just a few seconds using the reluctant seller philosophy. Power negotiators always try to edge up the other side's negotiating range before the real negotiating ever begins. So power negotiators always play reluctant seller when they're selling. It squeezes the negotiating range before the negotiation even starts. Now let's turn this around and consider the reluctant buyer. Put yourself on the other side of the desk for a moment. If you were the purchasing agent, how would you get a salesperson to give you the lowest possible price? If I were a purchasing agent, I would let the salesperson come in and have them go through their entire presentation. I would ask all the questions I could possibly think of, and when I finally couldn't think of another thing to ask, I would say, I really appreciate all the time that you've taken. You've obviously put a lot of work into this presentation, but unfortunately, it's just not the way we want to go. But I sure wish you the best of luck. I would pause to admire the crestfallen expression on the salesperson's face. I would watch him slowly package up his presentation materials with a heavy heart, as Lyndon Johnson used to say. Then at the very last minute, just as his hand hit the doorknob on the way out, I would come back with this magic expression. There are some magic expressions in negotiating. If you use them at exactly the right moment, the predictability of the other side's response is amazing. I would say, you know, I really do appreciate the time you took with me. Just to be fair to you, what is the very lowest price that you would take? Would you agree with me that it's a good bet that the first price the salesperson quoted is not the real bottom line? Sure, it's a good bet. The first price a salesperson quotes is what I call the wish number. This is what they are wishing the buyer would do. If the buyer said okay to that, they would probably burn rubber all the way back to their sales office and run in screaming, you can't believe what just happened to me. I was over at XYZ Company to make a bid on the furniture they need for their new headquarters. I went over the proposal and they said, what's your absolute bottom line price? I was feeling good, so I said, we never budge off list price less than a quantity discount. So the bottom line is $225,000, and I held my breath. The president said, it sounds high, but if that's the best you can do, go ahead and ship it. I can't believe it. Let's close the office and go celebrate. So the first price quoted is what I call the wish price. Somewhere out there, as the song says, there's a walkaway price, a price at which the salesperson will not or cannot sell. The buyer doesn't know what the walkaway price is, so he or she has to do some probing, some seeking of information. He or she has to try some negotiating gambits to see if they can figure out the salesperson's walkaway price. When the pushing agent plays reluctant buyer, the salesperson is not going to come all the way down from the wish price to the walkaway price. However, here's what will typically happen. when the purchasing agent plays reluctant buyer, the salesperson will typically give away half of his negotiating range. If that furniture salesperson knows that his bottom line is $175,000, $50,000 below the list price, he will typically respond to the reluctant buyer gambit with, well, I tell you what, it's the end of our quarter and we're in a sales contest. If you'll place the order today, I'll give it to you for the unbelievably low price of $200,000. He'll give away half of his negotiating range just because the purchasing agent played reluctant buyer. Remember, when buyers do this kind of thing to you, that it's just a game that they're playing. Power negotiators don't get upset about it. They just learn to play the negotiating game better than the buyer. The counter gambit to reluctant buyer is to say, I don't think that there is any flexibility in the price. But if you'll tell me what it would take to get your business, getting the other side to commit first, I'll take it to my people, higher authority, a middle negotiating gambit that I'll cover later, and I'll see what I can do for you with them. Good guy, bad guy, an ending negotiating gambit. So these are the key points to remember about reluctant buyer and reluctant seller. 1, always play reluctant seller. 2, look out for the reluctant buyer. 3, playing this gambit is a great way to squeeze the other side's negotiating range before the negotiation even starts. 4, the other side will typically give away half of their negotiating range just because you use this. So in this session, you've learned that you should never say yes to the first offer. You've taught how to flinch at the buyer's proposals, and I've taught you how to play reluctant buyer and deal with the reluctant seller. In our next session, I'll teach you how to squeeze concessions out of the buyer with the vice technique, why you should never offer to split the difference, and teach you what to do when the buyer says, we don't have it in the budget. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the third in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last program, we talked about 3 of the most important principles in sales negotiation. Never jump at the first offer, flinch at the buyer's proposals, and play reluctant seller and deal with the reluctant buyer. In this program, I'll teach you 3 more key principles. The vice technique, a simple phrase that will make you a lot of money, why you should never offer to split the difference, and what to do when the buyer says, we don't have it in the budget. First, let me tell you about the vice. What it will do for you will amaze you. The vice is a simple little expression, you'll have to do better than that. Here's how power negotiators use it. The buyer has listened to your proposal and your pricing structure. You ignored his insistence that he's happy with his present supplier and did a good job of building desire for your product. Finally, the buyer says to you, I'm really happy with our present vendor, but I guess it wouldn't do any harm to have a backup supplier to keep them on their toes. I'll take 1 carload if you can get the price down to $1.22 per pound. You respond with the vice. You calmly say, I'm sorry, you'll have to do better than that. An experienced negotiator will automatically respond with the counter gambit, which is, exactly how much better than that do I have to do? In that way, he tries to pin you down to a specific. However, it will amaze you how often inexperienced negotiators will concede a big chunk of their negotiating range simply because you did that. Once you've said, you'll have to do better than that, what's the next thing that you should do? You've got it. Shut up! Don't say another word. The buyer may just make a concession to you. Sales trainers call this the silent close, don't they? I'm sure that somebody taught you the silent close the first week that you were in the business. You made your proposal and then shut up. The buyer may just say yes, so it's foolish to say a word until you find out if he or she will accept your proposal. I once watched 2 salespeople do the silent close on each other. There were 3 of us sitting at this circular conference table. The salesman on my right wanted to buy a piece of real estate from the salesman on my left. He made his proposal and then shut up, just as they taught him in sales training school. The more experienced salesperson on my left must have thought, son of a gun, I can't believe this. He's going to try the silent close on moi? I'll teach him a lesson. I won't talk either. So there I was, faced with 2 strong-willed people who were both sitting there, daring the other to be the next one to talk. I didn't know how this was ever going to get resolved. There was a dead silence in the room except for the grandfather clock ticking away in the background. I looked at each of them, and obviously they both knew what was going on, and neither one was willing to give in to the other. I didn't know how it would ever get resolved. It seemed as though half an hour went by, although it was probably more like 5 minutes, because silence seems like such a long time. Finally, the more experienced salesperson broke the impasse by scrawling the word decision on a pad of paper and sliding it across the table to the other salesperson. However, he had deliberately misspelled the word decision, using a Z instead of an S. The younger salesperson looked at it and without thinking said, "You misspelled decision." And then once he started talking, he couldn't stop. Do you know a salesperson like that? Once they start talking, they can't stop. He went on to say, "If you're not willing to accept what I offered you, I might be willing to come up another $2,000, but not a penny more." He renegotiated his own proposal before he found out if the other person would accept it or not. So to use the vice technique, power negotiators simply respond to the other side's proposal or counterproposal with, "I'm sorry, you'll have to do better than that," and then shut up. A client of mine called me after a Secrets of Power Negotiating seminar that I had conducted for their managers and told me, "Roger, I thought you might like to know that we just made $14,000 using one of the gambits that you taught us. We were having new equipment put into our Miami office. Our standard procedure has been to get 3 bids from qualified vendors and then take the lowest bid. So I was sitting here going over the bids, and I was just about to okay the one I decided to accept. Then I remembered what you taught me about the vice technique. So I thought, what have I got to lose? And scrawled across it, "You'll have to do better than this," and mailed it back to them. Their counterproposal came back $14,000 less than the proposal that I would have accepted. Now you may be thinking, "Roger, you didn't tell us whether that was a $50,000 proposal, in which case it would have been a huge concession, or a multi-million-dollar proposal, in which case it wouldn't have been that big a deal." Don't fall into the trap of negotiating percentages when you should be negotiating dollars. The point was that he made $14,000 in the 2 minutes that it took him to scrawl that counterproposal across the bid, which meant that while he was doing it, he was generating $420,000 per hour of bottom-line profits. That's pretty good money, isn't it? This is another trap into which attorneys fall. When I work with attorneys, it's very clear that if they're negotiating a $50,000 lawsuit, they might send a letter back and forth over $5,000. If it's a $1 million lawsuit, they'll kick $50,000 around as though it doesn't mean a thing, because they're mentally negotiating percentages, not dollars. If you make a $2,000 concession to a buyer, it doesn't matter if you made it to get a $10,000 sale or a $1 million sale. It's still $2,000 that you gave away. So it doesn't make any sense for you to come back to your sales manager and say, "I had to make a $2,000 concession, but it's a $100,000 sale." What you should have been thinking was, there was $2,000 sitting in the middle of the negotiating table. How much more time should I be willing to spend to see how much more of it I could get? Have a feel for what your time's worth. Don't spend half an hour negotiating a $10 item unless you're just doing it for the practice. Even if you got them to concede all of the $10, you'd only be making money at the rate of $20 an hour for the half hour that you invested in the negotiation. To put this in perspective for you, if you make $100,000 a year, you're making about $50 an hour. So you should be thinking to yourself, is what I'm doing right now generating more than $50 an hour? If so, it's part of the solution. If you're aimlessly chatting with someone at the water cooler or straightening up your desk or anything else that is not generating $50 an hour, it's part of the problem. Here's the point. When you're negotiating with a buyer, when you have a deal in front of you that you could sell to your sales manager, but you're wondering if you could hang in a little bit longer and do a little bit better, you're not making $50 an hour. No, sir, no, ma'am. You're making $50 a minute, probably $50 a second. And if that's not enough, remember that a negotiated dollar is a bottom line dollar. It's not a gross sales dollar. So the $2,000 that you may have conceded in seconds because you thought it was the only way you could make the sale is worth many times that in gross sales dollars. I've trained executives at discount retailers and health maintenance organizations, HMOs, where the profit margin is only 2%. They do $1 billion with a business a year, but they only bring in 2% in bottom line profits. So at their company, a $2,000 concession at the negotiating table has the same impact on the bottom line as getting a $100,000 sale. You're probably in an industry that does better than that. I've trained people at some companies where the bottom line is an incredible 25% of the gross sales, but that's the exception. In this country, the average profit margin is 5% of gross sales. So probably that $2,000 concession you made is the equivalent of making a $40,000 sale. So let me ask you something. How long would you be willing to work to get a $40,000 sale? An hour? 2 hours? All day? I've had many sales managers tell me, for a $40,000 sale, I expect my salespeople to work as long as it takes. However fast-paced your business, you're probably willing to spend several hours to make a $40,000 sale. So why are you so willing to make a $2,000 concession at the negotiating table? It has the same impact on the bottom line as a $40,000 sale if your business generates the typical 5% bottom line profit. A negotiated dollar is a bottom line dollar. I don't care if you do brain surgery in your spare time. You'll never make money faster than you will when you're negotiating. So power negotiators always respond to a proposal with, "You'll have to do better than that." The counter-gambit's advice when the buyer uses it on you is to automatically respond with, "Exactly how much better than that do I have to do?" This is an attempt to get the buyer pinned down to a position. You should never make a concession to a buyer unless it's in response to a specific counter-proposal from them. These are the key points to remember about using the vice gambit. 1. Respond to the proposal or counter-proposal with the vice gambit, "You'll have to do better than that." 2. If it's used on you, respond with the counter gambit, "Exactly how much better than that do I have to do?" This will pin the buyer down to a specific. 3. Concentrate on the dollar amount that's being negotiated. Don't be distracted by gross amount of the sale and start thinking percentages. 4. A negotiated dollar is a bottom line dollar. Be aware of what your time's worth on an hourly basis. 5. You'll never make money faster than you will when you're power negotiating. The next rule is that you should never offer to split the difference when you're negotiating. In this country, we have a tremendous sense of fair play. Our sense of fair play dictates to us that if both sides give equally, then that's fair. By which I mean that if Fred puts his home up for sale at $200,000 and Susan makes an offer at $190,000 and both Fred and Susan are eager to compromise, both of them tend to be thinking, if we settle at $195,000, that would be fair because we both gave equally. Maybe it's fair, maybe it isn't. It depends on the opening negotiating positions that Fred and Susan took. If the house is really worth $190,000 and Fred was only holding to his overinflated price to take advantage of Susan having fallen in love with his house, then it's not fair. If the house is worth $200,000 and Susan is willing to pay that, but is taking advantage of Fred's financial problems, then it isn't fair. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that splitting the difference is the fair thing to do when you can't resolve a difference in price with the buyer. With that misconception out of the way, let me point out that power negotiators know that splitting the difference does not mean splitting it down the middle. Just split the difference twice and the split becomes 75%, 25%. Furthermore, you may be able to get them to split the difference 3 or more times. Here's how this gambit works. The first thing to remember is that you should never offer to split the difference yourself, but always encourage the other person to offer to split the difference. Let's say that you're a salesperson for a building contractor. You've been working on getting a remodeling job that you bid at $86,000 and where they offered $75,000. You've been negotiating for a while, during which time you've been able to get the owners of the property up to $80,000 and you've come down to $84,000 with your proposal. Where do you go from there? You have a strong feeling that if you offer to split the difference, they would agree to do so, which would mean agreeing at $82,000. Instead of offering to split the difference, here's what you should do. You should say, "Well, I guess this is just not going to fly. It seemed like such a shame, though, when we both spent so much time working on this proposal." People become more flexible in relationship to how long they've been negotiating. We spent so much time on this proposal and we've come so close to a price with which we could both live. It seems like a shame that it's all going to collapse when we're only $4,000 apart. If you keep stressing the time that you've spent on it and the small amount of money that you're apart on the price, eventually the other people will say, look, why don't we split the difference? You act dumb and say, let's see, split in the difference. What would that be? I'm at $84,000, you're at $80,000. Oh, what you're telling me is that you'd come up to $82,000. Is that what I hear you saying? Well, yes, they say, if you'll come down to $82,000, then we'll settle for that. In doing this, you have immediately shifted the negotiating range from $80,000 to $84,000. The negotiating range is now $82,000 to $84,000, and you have yet to concede an additional dime. So you say, $82,000 sounds a lot better than $80,000. Tell you what, let me take it to my partners. I'll teach you in a later session why you should always have a higher authority with whom you have to check, and see how they feel about it. I'll tell them that you came out to $82,000, and we'll see if we can put it together now. I'll get back to you tomorrow. The next day you can get back to them and say, wow, my partner's tough to deal with right now. I felt sure that I could get them to go along with $82,000, but we spent 2 hours last night going over the figures again, and they insist that we'll lose money if we go a penny below $84,000. But good golly, we're only $2,000 apart on this job now. Surely we're not going to let it all fall apart when we're only $2,000 apart. If you keep that up long enough, eventually they'll offer to split the difference again. If you're able to get them to split the difference again, this gambit has made you an extra $1,000 of bottom line profit. However, even if you can't get them to split the difference again, and you end up at the same $82,000 that you would have done if you had offered to split the difference, something very significant has happened here. What was the significant thing that happened? Right. They think they won because you got them to propose splitting the difference at $82,000. Then you got your partners to reluctantly agree to a proposal that they had made. If you had suggested splitting the difference, then you would have been putting a proposal on the table and forcing them to agree to a proposal that you had made. That may seem like a very subtle thing to you, but it can dramatically affect who felt they won and who felt they lost. Remember, the essence of power negotiating is to always leave the other side thinking that they won. So the rule is never offer to split the difference, but always encourage the other person to offer to split the difference. The counter gambit when the buyer tries to get you to split the difference is to use higher authority and good guy, bad guy. It seems reasonable to me, but I don't have the authority. If you'll propose it, I'll take it to my people and I'll see if I can get them to accept it. So the key points to remember about not offering to split the difference are, 1, don't fall into the trap of thinking that splitting the difference is the fair thing to do. 2, splitting the difference doesn't mean down the middle because you can do it more than once. 3, never offer to split the difference, but instead encourage the other side to offer to split the difference. 4, by getting them to offer to split the difference, you put them in a position of suggesting the compromise. Then you can reluctantly agree to their proposal, making them feel that they won. The hot potato is when the buyer wants to give you their problem and have you make it your problem. It's like tossing you a hot potato at a barbecue. What hot potatoes do your buyers toss you? Do you ever hear, we just don't have it in the budget? Whose problem is that they didn't budget properly for your fine product or service? It's their problem, right? Not yours. But they'd like to toss it to you and make it yours. How about, I can't authorize that? Whose problem is that he hasn't developed the trust of the people to whom he reports? It's his, right? Not yours. But he'd like to toss it to you and make it yours. You've probably had a customer call you to say, I need you to move my delivery up. If those parts are not here first thing in the morning, the entire assembly line comes to a screeching halt. Whose scheduling problem is that? His, right? Not yours. But what he'd like to do is toss you his problem and make it yours. What you should do is what the international negotiators would tell you to do when the other side tries to give you their problem. I found out from my study of international negotiations that exactly the same principles apply. The same rules that apply for the negotiators in Geneva doing nuclear control talks apply to you when the other side is putting pressure on you. The same things apply and the same responses are appropriate. Here's how the international negotiators would tell you to respond to the hot potato. Test it for validity right away. This is what international negotiators do when the other side tries to give them their problem. They test it for validity right away. You have to find out right away whether it really is a deal killer that they tossed you or simply something that they threw onto the negotiating table to judge your response. You must jump on it right away. Later on is too late. If you work to continue to work on their problem, soon they believe that now it's your problem and it's too late to test it for validity. My background is as a real estate broker. I used to be president of a 28-office company in Southern California. In real estate, we used to get tossed the hot potato all the time. It was the buyer who would come into one of our offices and say, "We only have $10,000 to put down." Even in blue-collar areas, that would be a very low down payment. Our real estate agent could possibly work with it, but it would be tough. I would teach the agents to test for validity right away, to tell the buyers, maybe we can work with $10,000, but let me ask you this. If I find exactly the right property for you in exactly the right neighborhood, the price and terms are fantastic, your family is going to love it, your kids are going to love having their friends over to play, but it takes $15,000 to get in, is there any point in showing it to you, or should I just show it to my other buyers? Once in a great while, the person would respond, "Don't you speak English? Watch my lips. $10,000 is it, and not a penny more. I don't care how good a buy it is." But 9 times out of 10, they would say, "Well, we really didn't want to touch our certificate of deposit, but if it's a really good buy, we might. Or maybe Uncle Joe would help us with the down payment." Immediately, the agent found out that the problem the buyers tossed her was not the deal killer that it had appeared to be. If you sell home furnishings, one of your customers might say, "We've got $20 a yard for carpeting, and that's it." If you catch that hot potato, instead of tossing it back, you will probably start thinking of cutting prices right away because you assumed that what they told you was final. But instead, you test for validity up front by saying, "If I could show you a carpet that would give you double the wear and still be looking good 5 years from now, but cost you only 10% more, you'd want to take a look at it, wouldn't you?" 9 times out of 10, they'll say, "Sure, we'll take a look at it," and immediately know that the price issue is not the deal buster that it appeared to be. Another way to counter the hot potato if we don't have it in the budget is to simply say, well, who has the authority to exceed the budget? Sometimes you'll kick yourself at what happens next. They'll say, "Well, that would take a vice president to authorize that." So you say, "Well, you want to do it, don't you? Why don't you call the vice president and see if you can get an okay to exceed the budget?" Fair enough? And he'll pick up the phone to call the vice president and argue for an okay. Sometimes it's that simple. But you have to test for validity right away. I remember doing a seminar for the Associated General Contractors of Alaska. They had put me up at the Anchorage Hilton. And on my departure day, I needed a late checkout. There were 2 clerks standing right next to each other behind the registration desk, and I said to one of them, "Would you give me a 6 o'clock checkout in my room, please?" She said, "Mr. Dawson, we could do that for you, but of course we'd have to charge for an extra half day." I said, "Who would have the authority to waive that charge?" She pointed to the person standing next to her and said, "She would." The person standing right next to her. So I leaned over and said to the other person, "How would you feel about that?" She said, "Oh, sure, that would be fine. Go ahead." Another way to handle the "we don't have it in the budget" hot potato is to ask them when their budget year ends. I trained the 80 salespeople at one of the top health maintenance organizations in California. A few weeks before the meeting, the training director called me and suggested we have dinner together so that she could fill me in on how the company operates. Since I figured that she was going to pay for dinner, I picked the top French restaurant in Orange County, and we had a great dinner. As I was serving dessert, I said, "You know what you should do? You should invest in a set of my cassette tapes for each of your salespeople so that they have the advantage of a continuing learning process." As I said that, I was mentally computing that 80 salespeople at $65 per set of tapes would be another $5,200 income on top of the speaking fee to which they'd already agreed. She thought about it and said, "Roger, that would probably be a good idea, but we just don't have it in the budget." I need to make a confession here. I am very ashamed of what I thought next, but I want to share it with you because it may help you if you've ever had the same shameful thought. I thought, I wonder if I cut the price, if she would say yes. Isn't that a shameful thought? She hadn't said a thing about the tapes costing too much. She hadn't told me that she might be tempted if I lowered my price. She had simply told me that she didn't have it in the budget. Fortunately, I caught myself in time, and instead, I did what I teach, which is to test for validity. I asked, when does your budget year end? Now, this was August, and I thought that she would tell me December 31st. To my surprise, she said, at the end of September. So you would have it in the budget on October the 1st? Well, yes, I suppose that we would. Then no problem. I'll ship you the tapes and bill you on October the 1st. Fair enough? That would be fine, she told me. In less than 30 seconds, I had made a $5,200 sale because I knew that when she tossed me what was essentially her problem, I should test for validity. So look out for people giving you their problems. You have enough of your own, don't you? It's like the businessman who was pacing the floor at night. He couldn't sleep, and his wife was also getting frantic. Darling, what's bothering you? Why don't you come to bed? He said, well, we have this huge loan payment due tomorrow, and the bank manager's a good friend of ours. I hate to face him and say that we're not going to have the money to pay him. So his wife picked up the phone and called their friend, the bank manager, and said, that loan payment we have coming due tomorrow, we don't have the money to pay it. The husband exploded. He said, what did you do that for? That's what I was afraid of. And she said, well, dear, now it's his problem, and you can come to bed. Don't let other people give you their problems. So the counter gambit to the hot potato is to test for validity right away by asking who has the authority to exceed the budget, or who has the authority to waive that charge, or when does your budget year end? If you can break through the barrier of the problem they're trying to give you, even if it is hypothetical, you have eliminated the hot potato. So in this session, you've learned how to use the vice technique. You'll have to do better than that, and use the counter gambit. Exactly how much better than that do I have to do? You've learned why you should never offer to split the difference, and what to do when the buyer tries to give you his problem, such as, we don't have it in the budget. In our next session, I'll teach you why the value of the service you perform always seems to go downhill. Then I'll teach you a technique that a vice president at a Fortune 50 company told me was the most important thing he'd ever learned at a seminar. Then I'll teach you how to nibble and how to stop the buyer nibbling on you. This is Roger Dawson. Thank you for choosing to become a power negotiator. This is Roger Dawson. Welcome back to the fourth in a series of 12 programs that will turn you into a power negotiator and teach you to make more sales at higher prices than you ever thought possible. In our last program, you learned how to use the vice technique. You'll have to do better than that. And use the counter gambit. Exactly how much better than that do I have to do? You've learned why you should never offer to split the difference and what to do when the buyer tries to give you his problems, such as, we don't have it in the budget. In this program, I'll teach you three more key principles. First, why the value of the service you perform always seems to go downhill. Then I'll teach you a technique that a vice president at a Fortune 50 company told me was the most important thing he'd ever learned at a seminar. Then I'll teach you how to nibble and how to stop the buyer nibbling on you. First, let me tell you about the principle of the declining value of services. It teaches you something that you can count on in dealing with buyers, that any concession you make to them will quickly lose its value. The value of any material object you buy may go up in value over the years, but the value of services always appears to decline rapidly after you have performed those services. For this reason, power negotiators know that any time you make a concession to the buyer in a negotiation, you should ask for a reciprocal concession right away, because the favor that you did the buyer now loses value very quickly. 2 hours from now, the value of it will have diminished substantially. Real estate salespeople are very familiar with the principle of the declining value of services. When the seller of a property has a problem with it and the real estate salesperson offers to solve that problem for a 6% listing fee, it doesn't sound like an enormous amount of money. However, the minute that she has performed the service by finding the buyer, then suddenly that 6% starts to sound like a tremendous amount of money. 6%, that's $12,000, the seller is saying. For what? What did she do? All she did was put it in the multiple listing service. She did much more than that to market the property and negotiate the contract, but remember the principle. The value of a service always appears to diminish rapidly once you have performed that service. I'm sure that you've experienced that, haven't you? A buyer with whom you do a small amount of business has called you. They're in a state of panic because the supplier from whom they get the bulk of their business has let them down on a shipment. Now their entire assembly line has to shut down tomorrow unless you can work miracles and get a shipment to them first thing in the morning. Sound familiar? So you work all day and through the night, rescheduling shipments all over the place. Against all odds, you're able to get a shipment there just in time for the assembly line to keep operating. You even show up at the buyer's plant and personally supervise the unloading of the shipment. And the buyer loves you for it. He or she comes down to the dock where you are triumphantly wiping the dirt off your hands and says, "I can't believe you were able to do that for me. This is unbelievable service. You are absolutely incredible. Love you, love you, love you." So you say, "Happy to do it for you, Joe. That's the kind of service we can give when we have to. Don't you think it's time we looked at my company being your sole supplier?" He replies, "That does sound good, but I don't have time to talk about it now because I've got to get over to the assembly line and be sure that it is running smoothly. Come to my office Monday morning at 10 o'clock and we'll go over it. Better yet, come by at noon and I'll buy you lunch. I really appreciate what you did for me. You are fantastic. Love you, love you, love you." So all weekend long you think to yourself, "Boy, do I have this one made. Does he owe me?" However, Monday rolls around and negotiating with the buyer is just as hard as ever. What went wrong? The declining value of services came into play. The value of a service always appears to decline rapidly after you have performed the service. It tells you that if you make a concession during a negotiation, get a reciprocal concession right away. Don't wait. Don't be sitting there thinking that because you did them a favor, they owe you and that they will make it up to you later. With all the goodwill in the world, the value of what you did goes down rapidly in their mind. For the same reason, consultants know that they should always negotiate their fee up front, not afterward. Plumbers know that, don't they? They know that the time to negotiate with you is before they do the work, not after. I had a plumber out to the house. After looking at the problem, he slowly shook his head and said, "Mr. Dawson, I know what the problem is, and I can fix it for you. It'll cost you $150. I said, "Fine, go ahead." You know how long it took him to do the work? 5 minutes. I said, "No, wait a minute. You're going to charge me $150 for 5 minutes work? I'm a nationally known speaker, and I don't make that kind of money." He replied, "I didn't make that kind of money either when I was a nationally known speaker." Let's review the key points to remember about the declining value of services. 1, the value of a material object may go up, but the value of services always appears to go down. 2, don't make a concession and trust that the other side will make it up to you later. 3, if you sell your services, negotiate your fee before you do the work. Now let's talk about a gambit that will probably make you thousands of dollars a year once you start using it, maybe tens of thousands of dollars a year. The trade-off gambit tells you that any time the buyer asks you for a concession in the negotiations, you should automatically ask for something in return. Let's say that you sell forklifts and you've sold a large order to a warehouse-style hardware store. They've requested delivery on August the 15th, 30 days ahead of their grand opening. Then the operations manager for the chain calls you and says, "We're running ahead of schedule on the store construction. We're thinking of moving up the store opening to take in the Labor Day weekend. Is there any way you could move up the delivery of those forklifts to next Wednesday?" Now you may be thinking, "That's great. They're sitting in our local warehouse ready to go, so I'd much rather move up the shipment and get paid sooner." We'll deliver them tomorrow if you want them. Even though your initial inclination is to say, "That's fine," I still want you to use the trade-off gambit. I want you to say, "Quite frankly, I don't know whether we can get them there that soon. I'll have to check with my scheduling people," note the use of a vague higher authority, "and see what they say about it. But let me ask you this, if we can do that for you, what can you do for us?" One or all of 3 things is going to happen. Number 1, you might just get something. They may just have been thinking, boy, we got a problem here. What can we give them as an incentive to get them to move this shipment up? So they may just concede something to you. They may just say, I'll tell accounting to cut the check for you today, or take care of this for me and I'll use you again for the store that we're opening in Chicago in December. 2, by asking for something in return, you've elevated the value of the concession. When you're negotiating, why just give anything away? Always make a big deal out of it. You may need that later on. Later on, you may need to be able to go to them and say, do you remember last August when you needed me to move that shipment up for you? You know how hard I had to talk to my people to get them to reschedule all our shipments? We did that for you, so don't make me wait for our money. Cut me the check today, won't you? When you elevate the value of the concession, you set it up for a trade-off later on. 3, it stops the grinding away process. This is the key reason why you should always use the trade-off gambit. If they know that every time they ask you for something, you're going to ask for something in return, then it stops them constantly coming back for more. I can't tell you how many times a salesperson has come up to me at a seminar or called my office and said to me, Roger, can you help me with this? We thought we had a sweetheart of a deal put together. We didn't think that we would have any problems at all with this one. But in the very early stages, they asked us for a very small concession. We were so happy to have the business that we told them, sure, we can do that. A week later, they called us for another small concession, and we said, well, all right, I guess we can do that too. Ever since then, it's been one darn thing after another. Now it looks like the whole thing is going to fall apart on us. They should have known up front that when the other side asked them for that first small concession, they should have asked for something in return. If we can do that for you, what can you do for us? I trained the top 50 salespeople at a Fortune 50 company that manufactures office equipment. They have what they call a key account division that negotiates their largest account with the biggest customers. These people are heavy hitters. There was a salesperson at the seminar who just made a $43 million sale to an aircraft manufacturer. That's not a record. When I trained people at a huge computer manufacturer's training headquarters, I had a salesperson in the audience who had just closed a $3 billion sale, and he was in my seminar taking notes. This key account division had its own vice president, and he came up to me afterward to tell me, Roger, that thing you told us about trading off was the most valuable lesson I've ever learned in any seminar. I've been coming to seminars like this for years, and I thought that I'd heard it all, but I've never been taught what a mistake it is to make a concession without asking for something in return. That's going to save us hundreds of thousands of dollars in the future. Jack Wilson, a Chicago television producer, told me that soon after I taught him this gambit, he used it to save several $1,000s. A television studio called him and told him that one of their camera operators was sick. Would Jack mind if they called one of the camera operators that Jack had under contract and asked him if he could fill in? It was really just a courtesy call, something that Jack would have said no problem to in the past. However, this time he said, if I do that for you, what will you do for me? To his surprise, they said, tell you what, the next time you use our studio, if you run into overtime, we'll waive the overtime charge. They had just conceded several $1,000s to Jack on something that he never would have asked for in the past. Please use these gambits word for word the way that I'm teaching them to you. If you change even a word, it can dramatically change the effect. If, for example, you change this from, if we can do that for you, what can you do for us, to, if we do that for you, you will have to do this for us, you have become confrontational. You've become confrontational at a very sensitive point in the negotiations, when the other side is under pressure and is asking you for a favor. Of course, you're tempted to take advantage of this situation and ask for something specific in return. Don't do it. It could cause the negotiation to blow up in your face. When you ask what they will give you in return, they may say, not a darn thing, or you get to keep our business, that's what you get. That's fine, because you had everything to gain by asking, and you haven't lost anything. If necessary, you can always revert to the position of insisting on a trade-off by saying, I don't think I can get my people to agree to that unless you're prepared to accept a charge for expedited shipping, or unless you're willing to move up the payment date. These are the key points to remember about the trade-off gambit. 1, when asked for a small concession by the other side, always ask for something in return. 2, use this expression. If we can do that for you, what can you do for us? 3, you may just get something in return. 4, it elevates the value of the concession so that you can use it as a trade-off later on. 5, most important, it stops the grinding away process. Don't change the wording and ask for something specific in return because it's too confrontational. Now let's talk about nibbling. It's an important gambit because it accomplishes